This episode is brought to you by Netflix. Jay Kelly, the new film from Academy Award nominee Noah Baumbach. George Clooney stars as an actor confronting his past and present on a journey of self-discovery, alongside Adam Sandler as his devoted manager. Critics are calling it a declaration of love to the chaotic art of filmmaking, with the Wall Street Journal praising it as a transcendent comedy drama. Jay Kelly is now playing only on Netflix.
What if an appliance emergency didn't have to be? If your appliances suddenly decided they were done, don't stress. Best Buy has you covered with a wide variety of major appliances from trusted brands, in stock and available now. So you don't have to worry about laundry piling up, refilling the fridge, or that big dinner party you're hosting. Because Best Buy has the knowledge and expertise to get you the right appliance for your home. Learn more at bestbuy.com. Best Buy. Imagine that.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 203 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Alexander Hamilton. His name is Alexander Hamilton. There's a million things he went and did. But just you wait. Just you wait. Yeah, I can't really sing, but in 2018, after 3 years of Hamilton the musical, I don't know how and why you would start an episode about Alexander Hamilton without at least riffing on Lin-Manuel Miranda's lyrics. I mean, they're really great lyrics. But who was the real man behind the character Miranda created for his hit musical? That's the large question we're going to explore today. And we're going to explore it with a historian whose work on dueling and affairs of honor actually inspired the Hamilton the musical song, 10 Duel Commandments. Joanne Freeman, a professor of history and American studies at Yale University and a co-host of the podcast Backstory, joins us to explore the life and politics of Alexander Hamilton. Now, during our conversation, Joanne reveals details about Alexander Hamilton's early life in the Caribbean, how and why Hamilton joined the revolutionary cause, and information about Hamilton's politics and ideas about government. But first, as you've heard, today's episode is about Alexander Hamilton. And as Joanne will tell you, Hamilton is someone she became curious about because she read about him in a biography. Now, biography is a powerful genre because it aims to tell us so much about the life and deeds of other people. In many ways, biography can make aspects of history seem really personal. And that's why so many of us love to read biography and why so many of us developed an interest in history. It's just often the case that we're captivated by a life or the lives of past people. This is why the Omohundro Institute's digital projects team and I are working on a new Doing History series about biography. It's a 4-episode series that will pull back the curtain on biography as a genre, so we can explore what makes biography a biography, how historians research and write biography, and whether we can research and write biographies about all people or just certain kinds of people. We're going to make many of these inquiries as we explore the life of a person that you've been asking to hear more about, too. John Marshall, the 4th Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The fun begins in October, when the first episode of Doing History Biography drops on October 23, 2018. Okay, are you ready to hear more about the $10 founding father without a father? Sorry, it's playing in my head and I couldn't resist one more line. So before I earworm you too, let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a professor of history and American studies at Yale University. Her fields of interest are the revolutionary and early national periods of American history. She's a co-host of the podcast Backstory and the author of the book Affairs of Honor, National Politics in the New Republic. She's also the author of the newly released book, The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War. And she's the editor of The Essential Hamilton, Letters and Other Writings. And today, she joins us to explore the life of Alexander Hamilton. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Joanne Freeman.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on the show. Now, you're one of the foremost experts on Alexander Hamilton and his politics. And this is where I'd like for us to start our conversation. Alec wonders why you've chosen to focus so much of your research on Hamilton and the politics that have surrounded his life. So, Joanne, what is it about Alexander Hamilton that you find so fascinating?
That's a two-part answer, I would say, because I first got interested in Hamilton when I was essentially a kid. And at the time, I was young, and I think it was around the time of the bicentennial. And I was reading a lot of biographies of founder folk. And somehow I might have even started at A and just begun reading, because I remember reading about John Adams. I got to Hamilton, and he just was different. He had a weird beginning. He had a weird end of his life. And there weren't a lot of books on him. So somehow it felt to me like you could still learn things about him, and then everything that you needed to learn had been found out about everybody else. So I just got interested in him for, no very deep reason as a kid. But what I did do was go to the library and ask the librarian what the people who wrote these books, these biographies, what were they reading so that they learned about Hamilton? And the librarian pointed me to Hamilton's published papers, the 27-volume set of his papers. And I began reading that. And that then got me not necessarily only interested in Hamilton, but that really kind of sucked me right into the 18th century, because that to me felt like someone's life. I was holding someone's life in my hands, and I was trying to put the pieces together and figure things out. And why did he do this? And why did he do that? And so the first half of my answer is because when I was a kid, he was a quirky founder, and it kind of struck me. But through reading his papers, it really kind of sucked me into the 18th century. And the second half of the question then is that, when you're looking at politics in the early republic, which is the period that I'm most interested in, he's such an extreme character in so many ways that figuring out what he does and why he does it all by itself is interesting. But in doing that, you reconstruct a lot of conversations that are important conversations that were happening at the time. And you discover all kinds of cultural things, i.e. dueling. And he sort of exposes you to that as well. So in a way, he became a window for me into this larger period. And he's so extreme that he's a great track to follow.
That's a really great story. And I don't think you're alone anymore, Joanne. And what I mean by that is, thanks to Hamilton the musical, Hamilton is serving as a window onto early American history for so many people right now. I mean, he's causing people to become really curious about early American history, which I find exciting. So given that he's had this moment with you and he's now having this effect on so many different people, what can you tell us about the early beginnings of, as you say, this quirky founder?
Sure. He was born in the Caribbean on the island of Nevis. His parents were not married, so he was illegitimate. I suppose you could say, yes, he was a bastard. His father at some early point left. His father was a fourth son in a sort of lesser genteel Scottish family. I've actually been to Stevenston, Scotland, which is where the Hamiltons came from. And they had a very impressive sort of mansion estate. But as a fourth son, his father didn't stand to inherit anything. So that's probably why he was in the Caribbean, thinking that, like everybody else, if you go to the Sugar Islands, you could somehow make money. But he left at some early point. It's unclear why. So then Hamilton was left with his mother. His mother had been married to someone else and had left him. But one of the stipulations of the divorce was that she wouldn't or couldn't marry again. So in essence, we don't know whether Hamilton's parents did or didn't get married, but whatever they did, it was not a legal marriage, or they weren't married at all. So he stayed with his mother. She kind of ran a shop on St. Croix is where they ended up. And then she got sick and died. So then he was orphaned and he was sent to a relative. One relative, I think, killed himself. So, for those who have seen the play, although it sort of, jogs through Hamilton's beginnings, some of what's there is actually quite accurate. So he had a weird beginning just in and of itself. He's in the Caribbean, he's illegitimate, he's poor. And then he writes this letter. There's a hurricane. There was indeed a hurricane. He writes a piece about it, which is all sort of flowery 18th century pseudo-religious, oh, vile worm, kind of rhetoric. But it was impressive for, a young guy to have written. A number of people, and we don't know specifically who, although we can name one or two, put together a fund for him to send him to North America so that he could get an education. So bundle that all together. And, that is a beginning that's unlike a lot of the other beginnings of the people who we now call founders.
Now, that letter you just mentioned about the hurricane is in that volume of Hamilton's papers that you edited called The Essential Hamilton. So would you tell us a bit more about that letter and how widely it would have circulated to capture people's attention to bring Hamilton to New York?
It is written as a letter, which is interesting. It's written as a letter to his father. So it's unclear, it might have actually been a letter to his father. It might have been, like so many other letters written in this period, something that was intended to be published, because certainly that was a custom of the time. But it essentially works its way through the rage of the hurricane and what happened to the island. And then, as I just suggested, kind of jumps into a sort of religious mode of rhetoric about how this shows how puny humankind is. You're not going to make a poster and stick it on your wall as far as the rhetoric goes, but it's impressive for a kid to write something like that. So that, I think, combined with the fact that, he was working for a shipping company at the time, and he clearly was doing quite well as apparently the leading clerk for the shipping company. He was clearly a gifted kid. And so the hurricane letter, was part of what got him off the island.
We keep talking about Hamilton as a kid, but how old was he when he wrote this hurricane letter? And how old was he when he left the Caribbean for North America?
So we don't absolutely know the year he was born. It might have been 1755. It might have been 1757. There are one or two documents that suggest it was 55. He seems to have claimed 57. So, as a historian, initially I went towards documents, but the fact that, his wedding ring lists his birth year as 57, you might want to go there. So, if he was born in 55, I think that makes him 17. This is where my horror in mathematics shows itself. So I think he was either 15 or 17, somewhere around there.
So when teenage Hamilton, whether he's 15 or 17, arrives in New York City in 1772, what was it like for him to arrive in New York City alone and to experience this growing port town? I mean, it must have been really different from where he was in the Caribbean.
For sure. And he actually initially, I believe, goes to Boston and then travels south. But at any rate, no matter whether it's Boston or New York or even, where he ends up in New Jersey, it would have been very different. Years ago, I remember looking at something of his, a record of his from these years. And in the back of it was a really miserable sketch of a Native American. So clearly, that's a thing that struck him not long after he got to whatever colony he ended up being in. That was certainly one thing that struck him. It's a mistake to think that the Caribbean was this sort of backwater because it was a trading center. So it's not as though he necessarily went from the backwater to the city. But he did, come into either Boston or New York, a bustling city, with what would have been an urban sense of it at the time, with different looking people. And certainly far less in-your-face slavery apparent there. There was slavery, but there wouldn't have been the degree to which it infused society in the Caribbean. So in many ways, it was very different. And clearly, he was seen as being somewhat different because for a while, people refer to him as a West Indian. So he was perceived as someone who came from somewhere else.
Now, how exactly did Hamilton end up attending King's College in New York City, which we now know as Columbia University?
Yeah, typical Hamilton story. He was supposed to go to the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton. And he went there. I think Reverend John Witherspoon had a habit of going to the Caribbean and sort of trying to draw planters' sons into college. It's possible that that's how that connection was made. Or maybe there's a fellow named Hugh Knox, that Hamilton, sort of mentor of his, that might have sent him to Witherspoon. But either way, he goes to the College of New Jersey. He tells them that essentially he's in a hurry and he doesn't want to follow any set sort of plan of study. He wants to advance as quickly as he can through the course of study. And the College of New Jersey says no. So he then goes to King's College, which is now Columbia, and they essentially say, okay. And that's how he ends up there.
Okay, so I have to ask, did Hamilton ever graduate from King's College? And I ask because my understanding of it all is that he left college early to get involved with the revolution and its war.
Correct, right. So a long time ago, I was interviewed about Hamilton, and it was a long interview. And I think one of the earliest ones I did. And at the very end, I said something like laughingly, like, yeah, Hamilton was a college dropout. And of course, that's what got quoted was Hamilton was a college dropout. But no, like many other young men at the time, he did not graduate. The war sort of swept him up within it. And then, obviously life changed, the world changed, the city changed once there was open warfare.
And speaking of the revolution, how did Hamilton, this immigrant kid from the Caribbean, decide that he wanted to get involved with North American imperial politics and eventually the war that erupted over them?
Well, it was actually a multi-step process that got him into the revolution. And it's not surprising that one of those steps had to do with writing. There was a fellow named Samuel Seabury who was a noted loyalist, certainly would become a loyalist once there was open warfare. And Hamilton and he began to write pamphlets back and forth. Seabury wrote a few. Hamilton responded to one. Seabury responded to Hamilton, and Hamilton wrote back. And, the pamphlets, when you read them now, they sound like pamphlets written by a young man. He's trying to be funny at times. He's poking fun sometimes at Seabury's language. He's trying a little too hard. But again, for a new college student, they were an impressive performance. And you can see when you read the pamphlets that he's already immersed in the, I don't want to say ideology, but certainly in the swirl of ideas that's surrounding what feels like a necessary revolution. So that gets him, I think, mentally into the rush of ideas. The other part of his entry into the revolution is, again, not surprisingly, military. At first, like many other young men at the time, I'm sure, he's drilling, with a local young men. When the New York Provincial Congress says that they want New York to have an artillery company, he very typically and characteristically steps forward and wants to be the person to lead that, and other people support that, putting him forward for that. So he becomes a captain of an artillery unit, and they see some military action in New York and then in New Jersey as well. And it's from there that he goes on to join the Continental Army, but that's through George Washington.
We're definitely curious about Hamilton's military service and his relationship with George Washington, but before we dive into those topics, I'd like for us to consider Hamilton's exchange with Samuel Seabury a bit more. What exactly was their exchange like? You mentioned that they wrote pamphlets to each other, but pamphlets aren't personal letters, they're more like public documents. So what was this exchange like? What were these pamphlets like?
Correct. They are public documents, and they're public documents arguing about the authority of the various provincial congresses, about how America might be able to stand on its own. Like, how does the economy work in the colonies? In what ways is it fair or unfair as to what Great Britain is doing? So you're right. That's an important point to make, which is these are political arguments. This is a political debate that's going on. And on both counts, these are people, and again, this is part of why it's so impressive that it's coming from this young guy. These are people who are really immersed in the politics of the moment and have strong ideas about it.
Okay, now let's dive into Hamilton's military service. So you mentioned that Hamilton came to join the Continental Army through George Washington. What's the story there? How exactly did George Washington get Alexander Hamilton to join the Continental Army?
The most important thing to know about the story is that Washington, as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, desperately needed aides to write for him and sometimes to think for him. So, he was probably always on the lookout for young men who he could take on as aides. And there you have Hamilton, who has this apparently neat little, well-behaved, well-operating artillery company. In one way or another, Washington learns of him and invites him to be an aide. And Hamilton accepts early in 1777.
I wonder what it must have been like for Hamilton to think about and accept that invitation because, he was a young man, an artillery commander, and accepting Washington's invitation would have meant trading in his leadership role and the chance for battle and glory in battle, all for the opportunity to sit behind a desk in Washington's headquarters and write letters.
Oh, exactly. And that's initially, I think he's very excited to be at the center of things. And he is indeed good at sort of thinking for the general or managing to write things that are expressing what the general wants. So, he would have been a great aide, Washington would have been very glad to have him around. But for him, in a sense, that was partly a problem. Of course, he didn't know at the time that George Washington was going to go on to become George Washington. So in his mind, he had to emerge from the revolution with something because he's a young man brought to the colonies on charity. He has nothing, really. So he's desperate for something. And in his mind, what he wants is a moment of military glory that can earn him a reputation and that he can bank on to do whatever it is he does next. That's what he wanted. And of course, Washington needs him at headquarters. So he tries and tries and tries about 4 different times at least to get Washington to give him a field command of some kind, which during the time that they were working side by side didn't happen. And that was a source of tension between them.
How does the story end? Did he ever get his field command?
He did, but only after a bad moment between the two men and the passage of time. Hamilton is working for Washington, writing away. According to Hamilton, they were working on the 2nd floor. He went down to the 1st floor to deliver a letter. He met the Marquis de Lafayette at the bottom of the staircase. According to Hamilton, Lafayette had this way of sort of cornering you and talking to you when he had something to say to you, so Hamilton couldn't really break away. And then when he did break away and move back to go upstairs, at the top of the stairs was Washington glowering down. And he said to Hamilton, "You treat me with disrespect. You've kept me waiting these 10 minutes. You treat me with disrespect." Hamilton, who by this point is so desperate to get out of being behind a desk and to come away to earn some concrete thing he can take from the war, is that he just loses his temper, basically, and says, "I don't believe that, but if you believe that, then we part." And he storms off, essentially quitting. Washington, remarkably, sends someone out to apologize, and Hamilton won't take the apology. He sticks around long enough to be replaced, but he leaves. And according to what Washington says later, the two of them agreed not to talk about this in any kind of public way because it would be yet another source of vulnerability to the Continental cause, the Army. Hamilton did some complaining about it. So, Washington didn't. Washington kept his word. Hamilton griped. But at any rate, it's not until it's clear that things are heading towards Yorktown and there might be really a moment, a decisive moment. That's when Hamilton pushes to get a field command, and he finally does right at the end of the war.
You just mentioned the Marquis de Lafayette, and Sylvia would really like to know more about Hamilton's relationship with Lafayette. So would you tell us a bit about Lafayette and his friendship with Hamilton?
He's an interesting character, and Americans at the time, after the Revolution, really kind of embraced him as this symbol of the Revolution. He was a young guy. He was a teenager, a wealthy, aristocratic one who got swept up in the ideals of what was going on in the North American colonies and came in person to join in that cause. So he arrives at headquarters, and it's clear that at that moment he didn't necessarily speak English. Hamilton spoke French. So one of the ways in which they get to know each other is that for a little while, Hamilton is a translator of sorts. And the Marquis, he has a strong, in a good way, but a strong personality. I think Hamilton at one point says something like, the Marquis has his whims. Hamilton ends up being put in charge of satisfying the Marquis's whims. But it's clear that they like each other. They become friendly. They stay friendly for the rest of their lives. But they meet initially in part because Lafayette's at headquarters and Hamilton is helping translate.
Hamilton and Lafayette remain friends for the rest of their lives, huh? I find this curious because, as Sylvia points out, Hamilton really never did seem keen on the idea of returning the favor of assistance to Lafayette or the French people during the French Revolution. So did this, view towards France and the French Revolution impact his relationship with Lafayette at all?
Well, they do remain friends, it is true. And they're writing to each other throughout the 1790s. I'm not sure what Hamilton would have done, particularly given his politics and his desire for the United States not to get entangled with France and to maintain neutrality. It's unclear what it is that he really could have done, but it's also clear that Lafayette was not holding anything against him. They're writing very affectionate letters to each other, my good friend, all throughout this really difficult period for Lafayette. So I don't think he necessarily expected that either.
I guess that last question really brings us into the topic of Hamilton's politics, and a lot of listeners have questions about those politics. So let's take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, and when we're done with that, we'll get right to the heart of the matter and we'll dive into some specifics about his politics. Today's episode is made possible by The History List, a great resource for people like you and me who love history and want to know more about it. Now, about the time I was starting Ben Franklin's World, back in 2014, my friend Lee Wright, the creator of The History List, came to me with an idea and asked for my opinion. Lee had designed a t-shirt. On the front of the shirt, he had the word History Nerd. And in the place of the I for history, he had placed a silhouette of Ben Franklin. Now, I remember thinking, this design is so perfect. I mean, I'm a bona fide history nerd, and here I am with this brand new podcast about early American history that I've decided to call Ben Franklin's World. And here, Lee has this shirt that says History Nerd with Ben Franklin right in the word. I told Lee that I loved the shirt, and if he made one, I would definitely buy one. Well, not only did Lee make the History Nerd shirts, he sent me the very first one. Well, since that shirt, Lee has gone on to design several more shirts and other things for people who love history. He has all sorts of t-shirts, mugs, and baseball caps. He even has stickers, and I really love the stickers, because stickers allow me to express my history geek and nerdiness on just about everything. I have placed his Franklin History Nerd design right on my iPad. I have a sticker that depicts Abigail Adams, John Adams, George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton as superheroes on my microphone case. And then I placed his Repeal the Stamp Act protest sticker right on the back of my Kindle, which I have to tell you, I think is really appropriate placement, because the Stamp Act taxes paper goods like newspapers and pamphlets, and the Kindle is something I could read newspapers and pamphlets on, although I mostly read books. I don't think it matters, I still think it's good placement. Now, all of the designs I've just mentioned are available on t-shirts too, and Lee has even more designs than the ones I've mentioned. So you should go to thehistorylist.com and check them all out. And if you use the promo code BEN when you order, you'll save $5. So remember, check out all the cool history lover swag over at thehistorylist.com. Remember, that's thehistorylist.com. Okay, Hamilton's politics. Joanne, would you first give us an overview of Hamilton's politics and how they developed over time?
So, as I suggested at the outset, Hamilton is extreme in a lot of ways, and in some ways his politics were very extreme as well. Part of what enables him to get to that extreme way of thinking is because, of course, he doesn't belong to any one state. So, at the time, you really thought of your state as your country to a degree, and you had a loyalty to it and a sense of ownership and a sense of its bounds in a way that Hamilton never did. I mean, he becomes a New Yorker, but he never really had a hold of a state in the same way. So he is someone who wants an extremely strong national government, essentially from a very early point, and this actually goes all the way back to the pamphlet writing. He can see that the provincial congresses and then the Continental Congress, they're not capable of running the war effort. They're too weak to be, in his mind, a government. So he is one of the earliest nationalists, and a loud one, writing letters insisting that the government needs to be stronger, writing to people in Albany. He's being Hamilton, which is like very aggressive and not shy to say what he thinks. And that's what he wants. And in his mind, I think, he wanted something for America that would approximate the British monarchy, a limited monarchy, but wouldn't be an out-and-out monarchy. Now, because of that, if you think of the United States, after the Revolution, it has just broken away from a monarchy. And here's Hamilton, who, beginning in the Constitutional Convention, I'll come right back to that, openly admits his admiration for the British monarchy and then is trying to push the government to be stronger and the president to be stronger. It makes perfect sense that people thought that he was a monarchist. And for his entire life, he was actually charged with being a monarchist. Part of what they were grounding that on has to do with the Federal Convention. So he's at the Constitutional Convention. There are two plans. There's the Virginia plan that's presented by James Madison, which is a stronger government. There's the New Jersey plan presented by William Patterson, which is a much weaker government. And Hamilton stands up, and I think part of why he stands up and does this is because for all of these years, he's been trying to push for this moment when the government is going to be strengthened. And the New York delegation, he's outvoted. The other two delegates do not agree with his view about how much the government needs to be strengthened. I can't imagine how frustrating that must have been. So he stands up and gives a multi-hour speech presenting his own plan of government. And indeed, he wants an executive elected for life during good behavior. And it's an executive elected by electors chosen by the people. So there's even an extra bonus level of electors. He wants the senators to serve for life during good behavior. He wants each state governor to be installed by the national government. So it's really clear what he's doing. It's an extreme plan, and it's hard to imagine it would have been accepted. But that shows you right at the outset how much he wanted to strengthen the government and why he was an extreme character in his politics and why he got a lot of resistance.
With that context in place, let's dive into some of the specifics about Hamilton's political and social views. Logan and Dalen would like to know more about Hamilton's views on slavery. So, Joanne, what were Hamilton's views on slavery, and how did those views influence his politics?
Interesting. Okay, so because I think of the play and the way that the word abolitionist appears in that play a lot of times, the fact of the matter is Hamilton wasn't an abolitionist. He wasn't pushing for the immediate end of slavery. He wasn't expecting people to immediately surrender their slaves. He was anti-slavery. He joined the New York Manumission Society. So he was on the side of justice. He was on the right side, but he was certainly not pushing New York to be in any hurry. He was just helping a process along. And although he was anti-slavery, when you look at his papers and you see what he's like when he's fully immersed in a cause versus his slavery activities, when he's fully immersed in a cause, writing is pouring out of him. And that simply wasn't the case for his anti-slavery activities. So he is anti-slavery, but that isn't at the center of his politics.
Is there any truth to the story that it was Hamilton who helped George Washington see that slavery was antithetical to the principles of the Revolution?
To be honest, I've never even heard that story, but that would not necessarily make sense to me. Plus, if Hamilton was doing that, he would have been saying what everybody else was saying too, who felt the same way, right? It wouldn't have been a rare and uncommon thought for someone to come forward and say, we're griping about being slaves to the king, and now here we are slave owners. But I don't know of any evidence that shows that Hamilton was that person.
So I guess there's really no evidence either that Hamilton's anti-slavery views would have caused him to be in conflict with his in-laws. I happen to know from the records that I looked at that the Schuylers of Albany, his in-laws, owned several enslaved men and women who they had work in both their mansion house at Albany and on their estate at Saratoga.
Well, it's interesting. He clearly during the Revolution, because of the need for soldiers and the question of whether enslaved people should be armed, he grapples with it some, and he meets Elizabeth Schuyler, his soon-to-be wife, in the war, during the wartime. It's clear that he's working his way through what he thinks. His friend John Laurens is more aggressively anti-slavery than Hamilton. Hamilton writes a letter at one point for Laurens, sort of in support of Lawrence's plan to try and arm enslaved people so that they could fight and then they gain their freedom as a result. In the letter that Hamilton writes of support, what's fascinating is that some of his revisions survive. So he starts out by saying something like, these enslaved people, they may not be our equals. And then he crosses that out and says, they probably are our equals. So you can literally see him on paper sort of trying to figure out what it is he thinks and what he wants to present and how he wants to present it. As you say, the Schuylers did indeed own slaves. That did not make them unusual. And he doesn't really talk about that very much within his writings.
Speaking of the Schuylers, Brianna is curious about Hamilton's association and relationship with the Schuyler family. So would you tell us a bit more about the Schuylers, how Hamilton became associated with them, and, of course, what Brianna really wants to know is more about Hamilton's relationship with Eliza's sister, Angelica Schuyler Church.
The spicy relationship. The Schuylers were a very prominent family, a landholding family further north up near Albany in New York. At the time, Thomas Jefferson once famously said that he thought that New York in many ways was a southern state because you had these large landholders on what would seem to be the equivalent of plantations. Schuyler was one of those powerful landholding men and was wealthy. He served in the army, was a general in the army, and his daughters would have been around headquarters at various points during the war. Clearly, that in some way or another is how that put Hamilton and Elizabeth Schuyler up against each other, and they met. And there's a series of love letters. Elizabeth did indeed destroy a lot of her correspondence to him, not necessarily out of spite in any way, but a lot of women in this period, particularly of elite folk who were probably going to be in the public eye in some way. A lot of women, unfortunately, destroyed their correspondence. But we have his half of that conversation, and we have him responding to her. So you can see them working out that relationship. Of course, that brings us to Angelica, which was Elizabeth's older sister. And of course, again, because of the play certainly suggests, and it goes beyond that, it's been suggested elsewhere, that Hamilton and Angelica had some sort of a relationship that perhaps they should not have had. And how much of that they had has always been a question. Now, in my eyes, what I see when I look at pieces of paper is that whatever they were doing, and they were indeed very publicly flirting with each other, they were very publicly flirting with each other. They were not hiding behind the scenes trying to have a relationship. He was someone who I think liked to sort of go out and put on a show and have a presence and be a center of attention. And she was a really strong personality. And again, in and of herself, extremely intelligent and aggressive in her intellect. So I think the two of them enjoyed that kind of relationship. But there's a letter that Hamilton writes to her that's very flirtatious. And on the bottom, Elizabeth Hamilton writes a sort of, I'm sending in a word here too. It's clear that she saw the letter. So there is less spice there than I think some people want to know that there is. They want there to be some kind of spicy relationship. But there was indeed a misplaced comma, right? In the play and in some of the biographies, there's a discussion of the fact that one of the letters had a misplaced comma and the other person took that as a potential sign of love. In the play, Angelica gets very excited because Hamilton misplaced a comma. In reality, it's Angelica who misplaced that comma. And Hamilton who gets a little interested and is very quickly shut down by Angelica. Like, no, that's not really, no. But he asks, does that, my dearest, comma, Hamilton, does that mean something? No, it does not. But at any rate, I think their friendship was a kind of a friendship that existed in that time, a sort of publicly flirtatious male-female friendship. There's a great book by Cassandra Good called Founding Friendships, which I think talks about this thing, that kind of a friendship a lot.
Yeah, Cassandra Good's book does in fact talk about that kind of relationship a lot. And I think we even discussed it in our conversation with her in episode 94. Now, speaking of spicy relationships, Raymond is curious about the Reynolds affair.
Dun, dun, dun.
Exactly. So would you tell us more about the Reynolds affair and when and why it happened?
And that's a two-parter. The early part of it is when Hamilton is Secretary of the Treasury. Elizabeth and the children have gone up to Albany. Hamilton is indeed working on his own, doing Treasury business. And this woman, Maria Reynolds, comes to see him, claims that her husband is mistreating her. She wants to get back to New York. They're in Philadelphia at the time. She's heard he's someone who is charitable. Would he be able to do anything to help her get back to New York? According to Hamilton, he says he would be happy to help her. He doesn't have money lying around, but he would be happy to bring money to her wherever it is she's staying. So that evening, he does indeed go to wherever it was that Maria Reynolds was staying with money in hand. And according to a pamphlet that he wrote later about it, which I'll discuss in a moment, as he put it, it soon became apparent that more than pecuniary consolation would be acceptable. So whether or not he showed up intending to have an affair, that's what happens. And that affair goes on for quite some time. And he keeps trying to pull out. She sort of acts distressed at the idea of his pulling out. That goes on for a while and then it stops. The second half of this has to do with later in the 1790s, when one of Hamilton's enemies, who is in legal trouble, says, you know what, if you'll help me with this legal trouble, I've got written evidence that shows Hamilton misusing treasury funds. Of course, this makes people who are Hamilton's opponents very excited. What did this fellow have? He had bits of paper in which Hamilton was clearly paying someone a lot of money repeatedly. Now, of course, what that was blackmail payments, because he ultimately ends up being blackmailed by Maria Reynolds' husband. So these three Republicans, these three opponents of Hamilton, go to his house with these slips of paper in hand, thinking, we've got him. We always knew he was corrupt, and now we've got the evidence. We're going to confront him, and this is going to be wonderful. And Hamilton says, no, actually, here's what really happened, and displays the evidence of the affair. And that ends. But in one way or another, that gets leaked to the public, printed in a pamphlet. And Hamilton then feels compelled to step forward and explain the truth of what really happened. He's not misusing funds. He was actually committing adultery. He's not corrupt. He's an honest public servant, but a not so honest private man, which is an interesting argument to make. But the so-called Reynolds pamphlet is Hamilton's really interesting decision to step forward and say to the public that he is honest as a public servant and to, in a sense, surrender some aspect of his private character, probably assuming that for men in that time to commit adultery might have not have been as horrible a sin as it might have appear to us or might not appear to us today. That's a good question. But at any rate, the Reynolds pamphlet is him stepping forward and confessing to committing adultery and then offering a lot of detail because he was trying in a lawyerly kind of a way to prove his point. So he includes his letters to Maria, Maria's letters to him, great detail about when they met and how they met. So it's a, kind of something of a juicy and thus embarrassing pamphlet.
Gosh, what did his family think of this pamphlet and this very public display of both his private life and his infidelity? I mean, what did Elizabeth Schuyler think?
Yeah, we don't have a direct statement from Elizabeth. What we do have are letters from Hamilton that are extremely careful and apologetic. So there are letters that show there's some definite tension there. And the only evidence we really get of Elizabeth Hamilton's response to that actually comes decades later, long after Hamilton is dead. And Elizabeth Hamilton lives a very long time. She lives longer without him than with him. And when she's in her 90s, she's living in Washington at the time. She's paid a visit by James Monroe, who is one of the people who Hamilton thought leaked the information and thus got it out in front of the public. So Monroe goes to visit Elizabeth Hamilton and basically says, we're among the only few that are left from our generation. And Elizabeth Hamilton says something along the lines of, if you think that the fact that we're this much closer to the grave means I've forgiven you in any way, you're totally mistaken. And she leaves the room. So she joined, I think, with Hamilton and certainly blaming him for causing the controversy in the first place, although Hamilton committed the sin that created the controversy.
Now, earlier you told us about Hamilton's stand at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 and how he stood up and gave a multi-hour speech supporting a very conservative, highly nationalistic form of government, and that the rest of New York's delegates and others were like, no. Well, Mark would like to know how Hamilton moved from this very conservative viewpoint to championing the government of the Constitution in 51 of the 85 Federalist essays.
Right. Well, I think that's partly a matter of possibilities versus probabilities. So Hamilton wanted that extreme centralized government. Hamilton also saw that that was not going to happen, right? This is a country that has just broken away from a monarchy, and they're very shy, suspicious of that kind of centralized power. So what the ultimate constitution that ends up being produced by the Constitutional Convention, I think Hamilton was quite aware that that was as good as they were going to get. And he essentially says that a number of times, this is probably, we should give this a go. I don't think he really thought it would fully work. And I don't think he thought it would survive that long. But because it was as good as he thought could be gotten, he certainly supported it and certainly saw it as something that was far better than the Articles of Confederation. And that's why he comes up with this idea of writing these newspaper essays, defending the Constitution, explaining away things that might frighten people about the new government, joining with James Madison, actually, and initially John Jay to write these essays. Jay gets sick and drops out, but he and Madison become these sort of partners, writing partners, each frantically churning out these essays in the hope of swaying the public and then swaying ratifying conventions, really, to not be afraid of how much this new government might centralize the government and political power.
Out of curiosity, how effective do you think the Federalist essays were in securing the ratification of the Constitution in New York State as well as elsewhere?
It's really hard to know. Nowadays, because the Federalist essays are so famous, I think people tend to assume that, they were seen as the tomes of the authorities. And everyone said, ooh, what a wonderful argument. There's no evidence that they were treated that way. They certainly would have been offering a lot of material for those who supported the Constitution. They were put in newspapers, so certainly the public had access to them. They were seen at the time as a really valuable resource in explaining how the government was going to work. So you see, for example, when the new government starts in 1789, there's a senator, and in his diary, he says, I got to get my hands on a copy of those Federalist essays because somehow or other that seems important. That's going to help explain things to me. Although he very amusingly says, I don't want to have to pay for it. I have to find a way to get a free copy of those Federalist essays. So people knew at the time that they were informative, but it's unclear. You can't say that they absolutely swayed a decision.
Now, Danny notes that Hamilton seemed to be a man who had a lot of political power and influence during his lifetime. And she wonders if you would tell us about his real political power and influence and when you think that power and influence peaked and why you think it declined.
Well, he dies either at 47 or 49, depending on when you think he's born. So he packs a lot into a short period of time. And he really does rise very quickly for someone who started where he started and falls almost as quickly. So he's rising clearly in power by being made Secretary of the Treasury. That really is the door, the entryway for him into having substantial political power. He saw himself as a kind of prime minister. He sometimes referred to my quote unquote administration, right? So he really believed that he was going to be this central figure, acted accordingly, tried to issue directives to Congress, was very aggressive in asserting his policies and inserting his vision of what the government should be. And some of what he was doing was trying to corral the wealthy and influential to support this new government. So they benefited from aspects of this government and did indeed support it. For that reason and any number of others, there are a lot of people who are very nervous about what he's doing. What is he doing? Is he just like courting a sort of new aristocracy? Is he trying to create a monarchy? So he becomes extremely controversial, but he's controversial because he has so much power and because bits of his financial plan, there are several major steps of his financial plan, one after another, or at least some of them, get passed. So he seems to be getting what he wants. So his peak of power really is when he's Secretary of the Treasury. When he steps down from being Secretary of the Treasury in 1795, he essentially has to go earn money because he didn't make very much as Secretary of the Treasury. He goes back to his law practice in New York. America gets into an almost war with France later in the 1790s, which comes to be known as the Quasi-War, appropriately enough. And Hamilton ends up being made Inspector General of the Army at Washington's insistence. Washington is given commander-in-chief, but he's old by that time, so it's clear whoever his second in command in has a lot of power. So once again, Hamilton is put in a position of power, but now there really isn't much for him to do. The war never happens. So he's someone who is in a position of wanting to have power. The Secretary of War at the time, James McHenry, is a war buddy of his, and he's not being very aggressive in what he's doing. And Hamilton keeps traveling to Philadelphia and hanging out just so he can sort of be on hand to tell McHenry what to do. And McHenry doesn't want to know what to do. So he's frustrated on that count. And he doesn't like a lot about John Adams and his policies. John Adams wants to appease the French. Hamilton does not think that that is what should be happening. So behind the scenes, Hamilton is advising John Adams' cabinet. Now, you might say that that's the peak of his influence, but I would argue that that's not true because he's advising, but he has no real power. And so, when these cabinet members want to listen to him, they do, and many of them do, but he has no way to enforce or insist really upon anything. So I would say the peak of his power is when he's Secretary of the Treasury, and he begins a slow slide, which becomes a fast slide, into losing power in the late 1790s. When he writes the Reynolds pamphlet, he then writes another pamphlet that was not so smart to write, attacking his own party's presidential candidate, John Adams. He doesn't want Adams to be president. He wants the Federalists, his party, to be president, but he doesn't want Adams. The two men really do not like each other. So Hamilton somehow thinks he's going to brilliantly manage to lose Adams the election, but win it for Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, who is running alongside Adams. That does not work. And so he writes a second stupid pamphlet. And a number of people, even some close friends, come forward to each other and begin to say, he lacks discretion. Is he someone we should be following? So he kind of writes his way into power and then writes his way out of power.
You just mentioned that Alexander Hamilton died either at the age of 47 or 49. And while we don't know his exact age at the time of his death, we do know that he died on July 12, 1804, because on July 11, 1804, he rode out to Weehawken, New Jersey to meet Vice President Aaron Burr in a duel. Joanne, the Hamilton-Burr relationship must have really been something for these two to get to the point where they were firing pistols at each other at Weehawken. So, would you tell us more about the relationship between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr?
It's interesting. They do indeed end up circling around each other in the world of ultimately New York City and national politics. They probably were occasionally bumping up against each other before the 1790s. But the fact of the matter is that when they're negotiating the duel, they both essentially say 15 years ago when we first started this. So they date their animosity to the rise of the national government. So clearly, that's the moment where there becomes an elevated stage. That's the moment when people are looking for power. And somehow for both men, that's the moment where they begin to feel that they're clashing against each other. Aaron Burr does take a seat in Congress away from Philip Schuyler, Hamilton's father-in-law. That does not enthrall Hamilton in any way. And ultimately, Burr ends up, I don't want to say siding, but he becomes more Republican in his political sensibility. So the two clearly begin to see each other as political opponents. The election of 1800 really brings that kind of opposition to a new height. Ultimately, the election of 1800 ends up being a tie between the two Republican candidates for president, Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson, although Burr was supposedly trying to run for vice president, but he doesn't step aside when it's tied. Faced with what must have been the ultimate Hamilton nightmare of Jefferson or Burr, he much prefers Jefferson, who he thinks will pander to the public enough that he won't do something irresponsible, whereas Burr, he thinks, will be totally irresponsible with power and should not be given the reins of government. So in that election, he writes all over the place trying to get people to not vote for Burr. It's unclear if he had any influence. People respond, sort of, oh, interesting thought there, Hamilton, but it's not clear that he decided the election. That would be dramatic, but not necessarily true. But it is true that Burr got a sense then of the degree to which Hamilton was really sort of out there gunning against him. I think he saw it in a sort of more close-up kind of a way than he'd realized before. As early as 1792, Hamilton says, I consider it my religious duty to oppose Burr's career. But 1800, I think, is what drives that home. There's evidence that the two of them almost got involved in a duel after that 1800 election, but they don't. And New York politics goes on. So both then become local politicians in New York politics on opposite sides. And Burr, who is not beloved by Jefferson because he didn't step aside and agree to be vice president when the tie happened, only serves one term as vice president. After that, he goes back and thinks, okay, now I'm going to be a New York City politician. He actually runs for governor of New York. Hamilton is not thrilled with that idea either. He really just doesn't trust Burr with power. He thinks of him as a demagogue who is just looking to get power and then do as much as he can with it. He sees him as a danger to government, a danger to the nation. He really has this idea in his head, and I think there's probably nothing you could have said to him that would dissuade him. So he begins again when Burr is running for governor to talk about Burr, to speak against Burr, to campaign against Burr, and something gets published in a newspaper that is evidence of some of the things that Hamilton has been saying. And Burr, at this point, he does not become governor, and his friends begin to say, well, why should we be following this fellow? I mean, he doesn't have power and he allows himself to be trounced on like that. Is he a leader? Should we be following him? So Burr feels compelled to do something after losing the election as governor to defend his reputation, defend his name. And someone hands him a copy of a newspaper that has in it a letter that describes some of what Hamilton was saying about Burr.
Well, we've certainly talked a lot about Hamilton, but surprisingly, there's one aspect we haven't talked about explicitly, and that's his writing. Now, there's a lot of documentation about Hamilton, and you've mentioned some of it as we've talked. And in your edited volume, The Essential Hamilton, you note that taken together, all of Hamilton's writings serve as a window onto Hamilton's brief and crowded life. So, Joanne, how and why do Hamilton's various writings serve as a window onto his life? And what do you think that window reveals about his legacy to the history of the United States?
Well, that's a good question. I think this relates back to some of what I was talking about at the outset of our interview. As a writer and as a thinker, he wasn't shy. So he dumps on paper what he's thinking for better and worse. Sometimes that hurts him. But when you read his letters, when you read his public papers, you certainly get a really strong sense of his ideas and how he propounded them. He was part of a conversation, an argument that was going on in the founding period about political power. Jefferson was another part of that argument. And I think for a very long time, Jefferson was seen as the guy. Hamilton for so long was not recognized as really being an important part of that argument. I think when you look at his papers, you realize the degree to which there really was a debate, a high stakes debate that had different points of view. And Hamilton's point of view is readily apparent in his writings. And you can see his politics, you can see his politicking, because that's also very apparent, his abrasiveness and his aggressiveness and the ways in which he's trying to corral people to do what he wants them to do, trying to meld some kind of way of organizing politicians to do what he wants them to do. So you get a sense of his style, you get a sense of his thoughts, you really get a sense of him on paper. And again, I think it's so important to think about the founding period generally and the 1790s, and even really the first half of the 1790s particularly, as an argument between different viewpoints. Hamilton's papers really reconstruct part of that argument. And it needs to be threaded in there as part of what people were thinking about and arguing for and against at the time to come up with what really ends up being, in many ways, a compromise.
We should move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Tim would like to know, in your opinion, what might have happened if Alexander Hamilton had become president of the United States? What kind of president do you think Hamilton would have been?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I'm really in the time warp. I'll say first, I don't think he ever expected that. A lot of people think that, of course, that was his ultimate goal. He knew that he wasn't popular. He liked the fact that he wasn't popular. He distrusted democracy on a certain level. And I think he believed the fact that the public often didn't like him was a sign that he was doing the right thing because he was doing what he felt was right. He wasn't pandering to the public. So I don't think he had any illusion. I don't think he assumed he would ever be president. If he had become president, I don't think he would have been a great president because he was not good at all of the things you need to be good at as president. He wasn't good at delegating responsibility. He wanted to do everything himself. He wasn't good at watching his words and being diplomatic in a literal or figurative way. I don't think he would have been a very good president. I think certainly in some way or another, he would have been trying to empower the presidency. Who knows to what degree, how much, but that would have guaranteed more controversy for sure. I don't think he would have been a great president.
Now, before we conclude, we need to offer Joanne congratulations because her new book, The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War, just came out. So Joanne, congratulations! And would you tell us a bit about your new book?
Oh, sure. Thank you so much. It's actually a book about physical violence in the U.S. Congress between 1830 and the Civil War. A lot of this violence was essentially censored out of what the period's equivalent of the congressional record. When you know it's there, you notice it between the lines. But over the course of a number of years, I unearthed a lot of physical conflicts. Knives, guns, fistfights, mass brawls, flipped desks, all kinds of physical violence. Roughly 70-ish fights on the floor of the House and Senate. And what the book does is look at what that tells you about how Congress was working, about how political parties were working, and about how the nation was functioning. And in a sense, it's a book about a cluster of things coming together, and violence is one of them, that helps lead to the conditions that help propel the nation into civil war. It's a book about a press that becomes increasingly powerful and then begins to spin conspiracy theories, north and south, about each other having to do with slavery. It's about people losing faith in the national government as the slavery crisis begins to build and there doesn't seem to be a solution. It's about two polarized views, north and south, on slavery, and seemingly there's no way to compromise that. There are any number of ways in which this is a period like a sort of test case of what happens when you have that bundle of things together. So in a sense, it's a new angle of looking at the engine that fueled the coming of the Civil War.
So now that The Field of Blood is out and published, what are you researching and writing about now?
My next project's going to be about Hamilton. I've already made a contract to write a book about Alexander Hamilton. I'm still at the beginning of that, so I'm not going to go into what I'm doing with it, but it will not be a straightforward biography. I'm interested in doing something more creative than that, but I'm still working on what I want it to be.
You answered a lot of our questions about Alexander Hamilton, but should we find ourselves with more? Is there a good place that we can get a hold of you and pose our questions?
I think the best way is probably through my Yale email address and website. My email is joanne.freeman@yale.edu. It's very public. And I have a page. I think if you look for Joanne Freeman, History Department, Yale, you'll get my page with all kinds of information about what I've published and what I've done. So I think in both of those ways, like so many other professors, it's not very hard to track me down.
Joanne Freeman, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for a fun conversation and for taking the time to answer our questions about the life, politics, and writing of Alexander Hamilton.
Thanks for having me, Liz.
For better or worse, Alexander Hamilton placed many of his ideas down on paper. And as Joanne noted, that habit didn't always work out well for Hamilton. The Reynolds pamphlet hurt his public reputation, as did the one he wrote against President John Adams. But Hamilton's penchant for putting all his ideas down on paper is actually a really great thing for us. As Joanne revealed, the papers of Alexander Hamilton allow us to glimpse the conversations that were taking place during the founding period and during the 1790s. And if we weave Hamilton's papers in with those of John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and others, we can see those conversations in great fullness. We can see individual ideas as well as how and why the founders ended up compromising, not just on the Constitution, but on other issues too. Of course, the papers of Alexander Hamilton are worth reading by themselves, because, as Joanne so aptly put it, they really allow us to see what made Hamilton such a quirky founder. And we should be grateful that Hamilton was quirky, because what made him quirky also makes him a great window onto early American history. As a kid from the Caribbean, Hamilton's early papers allow us to see differences and similarities between colonial life in the Caribbean and in North America. They also reveal a lot about the Revolutionary period. In fact, they allow us to experience the happenings of the Revolutionary period as Hamilton experienced them. First as an outsider, then as an insider. And then, of course, Hamilton's writings also offer us a front-row insider view into the Constitutional Convention, the process of ratification, and early national politics. In essence, the life and writings of Alexander Hamilton really allow us to see just how vast a world early America was, and how the founders attempted to help the young United States establish a solid presence in that vast world. Look for more information about Joanne, her edited collection, The Essential Hamilton, and her new book, The Field of Blood, as well as notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/203. TheHistoryList.com is a real fun place to visit because it has all sorts of fun t-shirts, stickers, and swag that will help you express your love for history and all your geeky and nerdiness about it. So be sure to check out TheHistoryList.com, and when you like what you see, be sure you use the promo code BEN at the checkout to save $5. Finally, Joanne discovered Alexander Hamilton as a precocious kid who wanted to know more about early American history. In what memorable ways have you discovered early American history? I mean, what made you want to know more about it? Personally, I fell in love with early American history as a kid. Now, I can't pinpoint the exact moment I fell in love with it, but I do know that my parents took my brother and I to a lot of historic sites related to it. They took us on the Freedom Trail countless times, and at some point in the 6th or 7th grade, I decided I needed to become more knowledgeable about American history, so I went to the library and just started reading. And I even had a plan for my reading. My plan was to start in the colonial period and work my way to the 20th century. Well, my plan was foiled because I never really made it beyond the American Revolution or early national period. In fact, those periods so captivated my attention, well, now I'm a historian who specializes in the Long Revolution. So there's my story. Tell me yours. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.